There's times when debates in this chamber really depress me, and today is one of them. I was hoping that today we would come to some agreement, a consensus on one thing that should be obvious to anyone who shows even a cursory interest in the issues of drug policy, and that is that the war on drugs has failed, and has failed disastrously. Because like the years of alcohol prohibition in the US, years of prohibition of drugs in this country has been an abject failure, leaving an unregulated product controlled by criminal networks, reaching into every community, making illicit drugs one of the world's most lucrative commodities. The impact on communities, in particular the poorest communities like the one that I live in, has been heartbreaking. Drug use is synonymous with organised and violent crime, people trafficking, early death, social isolation, mental ill health, with a consequential impact on the NHS, public services and the justice system, not to mention the impact on the well-being of individuals and families. People are the collateral damage of a 50-year war on illegal drugs, a war that has cost $100 billion a year. And despite this, despite all of this global money, we still see 200 to 250 million users across the world, many exploited, many criminalised for their addiction. And the failure of this approach is at its starkest and most devastating here in Scotland. We now have over 1,000 deaths a year. The streets are awash with cannabis and cocaine. Heroin can be bought in every community, and spice is the drug of choice in our prisons. I recently visited Addiewell Prison to discuss the spice problem. I visited local drug and alcohol projects. I've spoken to drug users who are desperate for help but unable to get it because of excessive waiting times. Certainly.
John Scott.
I thank Neil Findlay for taking an intervention. Would you agree with me that it's absolutely shocking that 90% of the people who present themselves at Bowhouse for H.M. Majesty's Government's pleasure to be kept there, 90% of those people present with drug problems on arrival? Don't you agree that something should be done about that?
Absolutely.
Neil Findlay.
And the last place they should be in prison, which more of them will be if we take the Tory approach. So John Scott's right, but he needs to speak to his colleagues to take a different approach. Because I spoke to someone recently who told me they learned a lot in prison. They learned how to steal and defraud. They learned how to take different drugs. They learned how to steal cars. The last place they should have been is in prison for a health problem like addiction. I've spoken to people who are sitting waiting months to try and see a first appointment because they have a heroin addiction. People who have been decades in addiction. They can have as many conversations as they want with their GP about getting more methadone, but they can't have a conversation about how they got off illicit drugs and how they got off methadone. And let me say this, I am not a methadone critic. It has its place, but many people want to be drug-free and methadone-free. I've met families of people who have taken their own lives because they can't get the mental health support they need. I've spoken to police officers on the front line, and academics and pressure groups working with drug users. And you know this, at every one of these meetings I ask them what we need to do. Not one of these experts, these police officers, these prison officers, health workers or drug users that I've met have said, let's continue with the current strategy, because you know what? The war on words is so jolly well successful, because it isn't. It's a disaster. With a public health emergency on our hands, the evidence is staring up at us from 1,000 mortuary slabs. Policy is failing, and its consequences are deadly. And it depresses me that an intelligent and decent man like Tom Arthur reduces this debate to a constitutional wrangle. It is pathetic, and I'll tell you why it's pathetic. Because I care as much for drug addicts and people using drugs dying in Manchester or Newcastle or London or Dover or Cardiff than I do here. No, I won't. And I hear John McAlpine depicting the train spotting generation. I've got news for you. Do you know what a drug user looks like? Have a look at the person around you, the person next to you. It isn't the dishevelled train spotting image that we have. It's people in your family, in your community. It's constituents who come to see you. It's friends and relatives. That's who they are.
John McAlpine.
Well, I would point out that that's not actually what I said, but surely you must agree with me that there is a legacy of the 80s and 90s in terms of the social and economic impact, which is what Glasgow University and other researchers have said, and that's why we've got high rates of deaths amongst older drug users. I'm sure that's a reasonable point to make, and I hope he agrees with me.
Some of that, but let's not
Excuse me,
depict...
Mr Finlay. Neil Finlay.
Thank you. Let's not depict all drug users like that. In fact, that's a minority, because the average drug user, if you speak to any of the academics, will tell you it's people like you and I, it's people in our families, it's people in our communities. So we should not have any exceptionalism on that. We see higher levels of infection here, mental ill health, homelessness, crime, more drugs available on the streets, and ultimately more deaths. I say it often, but if this was flu or measles or meningitis, we would have a national emergency on our hands. But I suppose there just ain't any votes in addiction. We must learn from other countries. We must learn from the Portuguese model of decriminalisation and harm reduction, the Canadian experience with cannabis, diversionary alternatives that are being brought in now with the powers they have by progressive Labour police and crime commissioners in England, who are establishing schemes to divert people away from prison and addiction. Not at the moment. Who are offering a scheme making offenders sign a contract and undergo mental health treatment and sort out their lifestyle. Who are joining up police and community and public health streams to improve outcomes from those suffering from addiction. Who are prescribing heroin in a medical setting for those who have not responded to other forms of treatment. Who are training people in naloxone, who are establishing early warning programmes to alert people of new drugs on the street, and a whole range of other issues. I have to say, timidity and political cowardice will not work. Neither will cutting drug and alcohol budgets. And I have to ask this final question. If one cow dies from foot and mouth, we see a national emergency declared. Here we see 1,000 of our fellow citizens dying and nothing much changes. This Parliament is failing, and failing our people, and we will continue to fail it until we see a very significant change in policy. And the strategy published, and the Tory strategy, simply doesn't cut it.